A devoted scientist develops drugs to control people's emotions for a greater cause. But little does he know what gut-wrenching consequences his bold experimentations are going to bring to his doorstep. By the way, welcome to Movies Explained, the channel you watch when TikTok brain doesn't allow you to sit through a movie. Today, we are going to explain a movie called Spiderhead, released in the year 2022. The film begins in an advanced penitentiary called the Spiderhead, where our lead scientist Steve Abnesti, aka Thor, and his assistant Mark are seen testing a new drug on one of the volunteers. Despite Thor's hideous attempts at joking, the test subject laughs. To further test their drug, Mark reads history chapters from a book, which makes him laugh even harder. Steve takes notes and gives his research a gold star, which is his way of approving the drug. Scenes rewind to Thor making his entrance in the Spiderhead by airplane, since his hammer to fly him around was previously crushed by his evil sister. One of the volunteers, Jeff, is woken up and asked to come by the dock for a remote field trip. Before putting him on a speedboat, he's blindfolded and brought to an open field. They ask Jeff to acknowledge and give his consent before they give him a new compound called the N40. Once Jeff gives his consent, they release a small dose in his body via the Moby pack attached to his lower back, which is controlled by Steve's phone. When the drug kicks in, Jeff begins admiring the view.
So to sum up, beautiful.
Once they're done testing, they blindfold Jeff again and bring him back. That night, he relapses into a flashback of his shameful past, in which he drives his car while being drunk and crashes into a tree.
Miss you.
Miss you more.
Overdrive. Nice calls.
The next morning, Jeff wakes up and joins another inmate, Lizzie, in the kitchen. While helping her with snacks, he talks about his feelings after taking a new compound. Meanwhile, the actual view of the field is flashed, which turns out to be a rundown, filthy factory. Later that day, Thor brings Jeff to the study room and introduces him to a newbie named Heather. Naughty Thor gives them a drug called the N40, which makes them horny and in love at the same time. As the two get wild, Thor enjoys the show. His assistant gives his approval, but Steve isn't willing to give his gold star yet, considering the abruptness in Jeff and Heather's moods after the drug has worn off. The next day, Jeff helps Lizzie with the snacks and takes a round to circulate the snacks among the inmates. When he offers one to Heather, she becomes visibly awkward. This lands Jeff into the second round of N40. This time, Thor does Jeff dirty by bringing in a twig-like grandma and doubling their dosage, which makes the experience intense. Later, Mark is sent to check Jeff's Moby pack after all the jostling. When he's on his way out, Jeff asks him to take him off the snack duty. The next day, Thor has Jeff in the observatory and puts the two women he banged in the same study room. He gives Jeff the free will to give any one of the two a drug called the Darkenflox, which capitalizes on fears and psychological pain. Jeff chooses not to give the drug to both of them. Not because he likes them, but because he has been a victim of Darkenflox and does not wish to inflict pain upon anyone. Since Steve doesn't have as much influence and charm as Thor, he practically begs Jeff to help him further with N40 to spread love in the world. The next day, Jeff gets interrupted by Lizzie. Before she can speak to him, his phone call privileges intervene. He's sent far away from the Spiderhead on a speedboat to make one phone call. He calls his girlfriend, but she doesn't respond. He leaves her a voicemail and returns to spend time with Lizzie by pretending to be Santa. The next morning, he's put in the study room with a fellow convict named Rogan, an angry bird. Jeff mistakes him for an N40 experiment and starts tweaking out of fear. When he's surprisingly dismissed early, he rushes to the observatory and finds Heather there. He figures she's doing the same job as he was doing yesterday, picking between two partners to see if the love drug has long-lasting effects or not. He lashes out at Steve for making everyone hump like animals, which emotionally breaks Steve down. He shows him the chart provided to him by his superiors, who want to conduct these kinds of experiments. Furthermore, he takes off his chill guy shroud and reminds Jeff that he is a prisoner, brought to a privileged facility like the Spiderhead to volunteer in drug testing to reduce his sentence. This tactic temporarily works in Steve's favor and shuts Jeff's inquiry. Now, he returns to Rogan and waits for Heather's response, who doesn't give either of them the drug. After the experiment, we see Steve reminding Mark to take the drugs along with him, believing he's doing it for a greater cause. It appears that they also have Moby packs attached to their lower backs. That night, Steve takes the love drug and dances around his room up until the effect wears off and turns him melancholic. The next day, Jeff sits with Lizzie in the cafe, where she pops the question about changing his snack duty. He shifts the subject to how these substances have been messing with his mind lately, but swears that she's the only one who makes him feel like himself. On the other hand, Steve is practicing boxing with Mark and discussing who to sell their drugs to. Once they're done, Steve insists Mark increase his dosage. Mark tries to lecture him on the risk factor, but he strictly emphasizes how he should take accountability for what he's created, in case he ends up getting questioned by the jury or their buyers. Jeff shows up unannounced, which startles Steve. He sends Jeff down with Mark to the observatory and hides his vials and other stuff. When they unite in the observatory, Thor calls Heather in the study room and enlightens Jeff with a new protocol set by his committee, according to which Steve is forced to give Heather the Darkenflox and observe how Jeff reacts to it. Jeff doesn't give his consent and keeps forcing Steve to make a call to his committee to change their minds. Steve agrees to do so, but ends up chatting with Lizzie in the kitchen and returning to the observatory to lie about the committee being too firm to back out. Now, Jeff gives his consent, but becomes very uncomfortable when Heather's fears take over and make her run around the room like a lunatic. However, things don't go as planned and get worse when Heather breaks her Moby pack when she's throbbing her back against the wall. The entire Darkenflox vial gets into her bloodstream, making her more disturbed and scared than ever. It doesn't take long for Heather to start smashing things around and finding a pointy object. Steve immediately sends Mark to stop her, but by the time he reaches there, Heather jabs the pointy object in her throat and smears off her blood against the glass Steve and Jeff are watching her from. Jeff freezes in a state of shock, while Steve locks up his stuff and runs to see Heather. Unbeknownst to him, he drops his keys in the laboratory while he's on the run. As he gets into a verbal argument with Mark regarding the issue, Jeff uses the dropped keys to open the drawer and discover 4 initials of an unknown drug in his diary. Along with that, he finds a pamphlet of his pharmaceutical company, which goes by his surname. This makes Jeff realize Steve was lying to him about the protocol committee and his boss's orders the entire time. He also finds a chart with all the drugs approved by Gold Stars except N40 and another drug. When he watches Steve running back to the observatory from the surveillance, he quickly puts everything back in the drawer, locks it, and throws the keys back on the ground. Steve senses fear by examining Jeff's expressions and gives him a pat on his back, which transfers Heather's blood from his hand to his shirt, while Jeff returns to his room and vigorously removes the bloodstain from his shirt. Meanwhile, Mark persuades Steve to take accountability for his actions and report this incident to the board. But Steve fears they will shut down his experiments, which is why he refuses to report. Later, he visits Jeff to see how he's holding up. When nothing fixes his mood, he brings Jeff back to his room and releases the laughter drug in their bodies to wash away the pain and sorrows. The two burst into laughter and gag. Steve opens up about how his father abandoned him when he was a child, whereas Jeff asks him why he doesn't leave this godforsaken place behind, unlike him. Steve admits he's passionate about his work, which is why he chooses to stay. The next day, Steve brings Lizzie into the study room and gives her a new version of Darkenflox. Lizzie starts fearing everything and shoves herself in one of the room's corners. Tiny things, like a paper stapler, trigger her fears and make her miserable. Later, she shares her experience with Jeff and wonders why they settle for such a horrible experience in exchange for getting their basic needs fulfilled. Jeff also opens up about how he deserves all this because he holds himself accountable for his friend's death and gets PTSD while having flashbacks of the accident again. Their traumas bring them closer than ever, prompting them to share a passionate kiss. Later, he grabs lunch with Lizzie but is interrupted by Steve. After hearing their synchronized reply, he suspects that the two are engaged in a romantic relationship, so he spies on Jeff through his hidden cameras once he sleeps. He finds Lizzie's sketch near his bed, which confirms that he's fallen in love with her without any drugs. The next day, he calls Jeff in the observatory and lies to him into giving Darkenflox to Lizzie, but he refuses to do so and leaves. Thor's evil side is revealed when he sends Mark to give Jeff B6, the second unapproved drug, which suppresses emotions and keeps people in control. When Mark pays Jeff a visit, Jeff exposes all the information he's been holding up about Steve's lies. Mark also confesses that he was promised to work for a greater and better cause, but instead got caught in Steve's web of lies. The two decide to plot against Steve. In the next scenes, Mark returns home for the weekend and doesn't show up the next Monday, claiming he's not well. Steve continues the drug testing with Jeff and forces him to give Darkenflox to Lizzie. When he refuses to do so, our glorious god of thunder throws a childish fit while having a meltdown. In order to sabotage their relationship, he inclines Lizzie to reveal why she was in jail in the first place. She tears up while confessing she mistakenly locked her daughter in the car and forgot she was in there, due to which she died and landed Lizzie in prison. Jeff becomes emotional and agrees to give her the dose. When he gives her the laughter drug, he finds Steve laughing instead of Lizzie. He then releases Darkenflox in his body, due to which Steve starts fearing Jeff. He realizes Mark betrayed him and put Jeff's Darkenflox in his Moby Pack instead. Jeff has him cornered and breaks the news about Mark bringing along the police to expose him. He takes out his personal notes and tells Steve that he knows he was controlling them with B6 all along. He gives Steve the dosage and makes him spill that he and Lizzie had served their sentence long ago, but he kept them oblivious to it. He now forces Steve to get the front door opened. As he's about to leave, Steve announces that B6 was never approved by him because it doesn't fully suppress the other person's emotions. Since his lifelong work is on the line, he resists the dose and attacks Jeff and gives Lizzie Darkenflox, which causes her to act out. He overpowers Jeff during the fight, but Jeff retaliates, during which Steve's Moby Pack breaks and releases all the drugs in his bloodstream. Jeff knocks him out and cancels Lizzie's dose. He helps her get back to her senses, after which she apologizes for not telling him her crime. He confesses that he still loves her and lifts her up to flee. Steve acts as a sore loser and alerts all the inmates to stop the imposters. Jeff and Lizzie encounter the inmates at multiple steps on the run, but their will to escape helps them get rid of them at every point. By the end, they get out and lock the prisoners from the outside. Unfortunately, Steve also makes it out and flees in his airplane. Jeff and Lizzie also flee on the speedboat. Mark is seen bringing in the police, but becoming hopeless to see Steve fly away. Luckily, Steve's N40 kicks in and blinds him from seeing a giant mountain ahead of him. As he thinks he's reaching for the beautiful horizon, he crashes into the mountain and dies. As Lizzie and Jeff laugh to see his downfall, the film ends. I am sure you liked the story recap. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps like that.